Power. Thank you. Hello? Hi, everybody. Hello, baby. Hello, baby. Oh? Hi. So, as you can see, I do not have my usual background up. And this stream is gonna be a reading stream. But if you're curious as to why it's gonna be a reading stream, it's because there's been a lot going on with racism and some fandoms, especially one that I recently joined. And I'm like, okay, listen, I am a Marxist-Leninist of the Black radical tradition. I am a Pan-Africanist socialist before I am a fan or quote-unquote stan of any content creator. If I see an opportunity to introduce decolonization, then I will simply bring it up. So with that being said, I'm going to do a little bit of reading today. And the first up is going to be Kwame Ture, otherwise known as Stokely Carmichael. He was a Black Panther and an advocate for the Black community and a pretty big radical organizer. And his work is foundational to Black activists even now. And he worked to build solidarity with people across the world, including Latin America, to resist imperialism, racism, and colonialism. So I'm gonna go ahead and read something he wrote. Black Power in the Third World. Kwame Ture, then known as Stokely Carmichael, and he gave his address in Havana, Cuba, of August 1967, and it's an address to the Organization of Latin American Solidarity. Black Power in the Third World. We greet you as comrades because it becomes increasingly clear to us each day that we share with you a common struggle. We have a common enemy. Our enemy is white Western imperialist society. Note that we use the term white Western society as opposed to white Western civilization. The West has never been civilized. It has no right to speak of itself as a civilization. Our struggle is to overthrow this system which feeds itself and expands itself through the economic and cultural exploitation of non-white, non-Western peoples, the Third World, or the Global South, as I prefer to say. We share with you also a common vision of the establishment of humanistic societies in the place of those now existing. We seek with you to change the power basis of the world, where mankind will share the resources of their nations instead of having to give them up to foreign plunderers, where civilizations can retain their cultural sovereignty instead of being forced to submit to foreign rulers who impose their own corrupt cultures on those civilizations they were to dominate. Anglo society has been nearly successful in keeping all of us, the oppressed of Third World, separated and fragmented. They do this for their survival, because if we felt our unity, we would know our strength. Especially here on this continent, when the Anglo is in the minority. He has for hundreds of years succeeded in keeping all of us who are oppressed from realizing our common plight. But the call of Che Guevara for a continental struggle against a common enemy would seem to ameliorate this fragmentation among those who would resist Western imperialism. We speak to you, comrades, because we wish to make clear that we understand that our destinies are intertwined. Our world can only be the Third World. Our only struggle for the Third World, our only vision of the Third World. Until recently, most African Americans thought that the best way to alleviate their oppression was through attempts at integration into the society. If we could enjoy public accommodations in the United States, motels, hotels, restaurants, etc., our condition would be alleviated, many of us believed. This attitude was characteristic of the civil rights movement and clearly points out the bourgeois character of that movement. Only the bourgeoisie are in a position to be concerned about public accommodations. The African American masses, on the other hand, do not have any jobs, any housing worthy of the name decent, nor the money to enjoy restaurants, hotels, motels, etc. The civil rights movement did not actively involve the masses because it did not speak to the needs of the masses. Nonetheless, the civil rights movement was a beginning, and because its aims met resistance throughout the USA, depths of racism heretofore unrecognized were laid bare. It had been through that the aims of the civil rights movement would be easily realizable because the United States Constitution supported them, but thousands of African Americans were jailed, intimidated, beaten, and some murdered for agitating for those rights guaranteed by the Constitution, but only available to whites. Eventually, the United States Congress passed a Civil Rights Bill and a Voting Rights Bill, assuring us of those rights for which we had been agitating. By this time, however, more and more of us were realizing that our problems would not be solved by the enacting of these laws. In fact, these laws did not begin to speak to our problems. Our problems were an inherent part of the capitalist system and therefore could not be alleviated within that system. The African American masses had been outside the civil rights movement. For 4 years, they watched to see if any significant changes would come from the nonviolent demonstrations. It became clear to us that nothing would change, and in the summer of 1964, only a couple of weeks after the Civil Rights Bill was passed, the first of what is now over 100 rebellions occurred. The following year, the same year that the Voting Rights Bill was enacted, one of the largest rebellions occurred in Watts. These rebellions are increasing with intensity and frequency each year until now practically every major city has seen us rise to say, "We will seize the day or be killed in the attempt." The civil rights movement could never attract and hold the young bloods who clearly understood the savagery of white United States and who are ready to meet this savagery with armed resistance. It is the young bloods who contain especially the hatred Che Guevara speaks of when he says, hatred as an element of the struggle, relentless hatred of the enemy that impels us over and beyond the natural limitation of man and transforms us into an effective, violent, selecting, and cold-killing machine. The Black Power movement has been the catalyst for the bringing together of these young bloods, the real revolutionary proletariat, ready to fight by any means necessary for the liberation of our people. In exposing the intent of racism and exploitation which it permeates all institutions in the United States, the Black Power movement has unique appeal to young black students on campuses across the country. These students have been deluded by the fiction that exists in white North America that if the black man would educate himself and behave himself, he would be acceptable enough to leave the ranks of the oppressed and join white society. This year, when provoked by savage white policemen, students on many campuses fought back, whereas before they had accepted these incidents without rebellion. And students, as a part of these rebellions, they begin to require a resistance consciousness. They begin to realize that white North America might let a very few of them escape one by one into the mainstream of our society. But as soon as blacks move in concert around their blackness, you will reply with a fury which reveals their true racist nature. We are moving to control our African American communities as you are moving to wrest control of your countries, of the entire Latin continent from the hands of foreign imperialist powers. Therefore, there is only one course open to us. We must change North America so that the economy and politics of the country will be in the hands of the people. Our particular concern is our people, African Americans, but it is clear that a community based on the community ownership of all property would not exist within the present capitalist framework. For the total transformation to take place, whites must see the struggle that we're engaged in as being their own struggle. At present time, they do not. Even though the white worker is exploited, he sees his own best interests lying with the power structure. Because of the racist nature of this country, we cannot work in white communities, but have asked those whites who work with us to go into their own communities to begin propagandizing and organizing. When the white workers realize their true condition, then there will exist the possibilities for alliances between ourselves and them. However, we cannot wait for this to happen or despair if it does not happen. The struggle we are engaged in is international. We well know what happens in Vietnam affects our struggle here, and what we do affects the struggle of the Vietnamese people. This is even more apparent when we look at ourselves, not as African Americans of the United States, but as African Americans of the Americas. At the present moment, the power structure has sown the seeds of hate and discord between African Americans and Spanish speaking people in the large cities where they live. In the state of California, Mexican Americans and Spanish speaking people comprise almost 50% of the population, yet the two view each other with suspicion and sometimes outright hostility. We recognize this as the old trick of divide and conquer, and we are working to see that it does not succeed this time. Last week, Puerto Ricans and blacks took to the streets together in New York City to fight against the police, which demonstrates success in this area. Our destiny cannot be separated from the destiny of the Spanish-speaking people in the United States and of the Americas. Our victory will not be achieved unless they celebrate their liberation side by side with us. But it is not their struggle, but our struggle. We have already pledged ourselves to do what we are asked to aid the struggle for the independence of Puerto Rico, to free it from domination by United States business and military interests. And we look upon Cuba as a shining example of hope in our hemisphere. We do not view our struggle as being contained within the boundaries of the United States, as they are defined by present-day maps. Instead, we look to a day where true United States of America will extend from Tierra del Fuego to Alaska, when those formerly oppressed will stand together, a liberated people. Our people are a colony within the United States. You are colonies outside the United States. It is more than a figure of speech to say that the black communities in America are the victims of white imperialism and colonial exploitation. This is in practical, economic, and political terms true. There are over 30 million of us in the United States. For the most part, we live in sharply defined areas in the rural black belt areas and shanty towns of the South, and more in the slums of the northern and western industrial cities. It is estimated that in another 5 to 10 years, 2/3 of our 30 million will be in the ghettos and the heart of the cities. Joining us are the hundreds and thousands of Puerto Rican, Mexican American, and American Indian populations. The American city is, in essence, populated by people of the third world, while the white middle class flee the cities to the suburbs. In these cities, we do not control our own resources. We do not control the land, the house, or the stores. These are owned by whites who live outside the community. These are very real colonies, as their capital and cheap labor are exploited by those who live outside the cities. White power makes the laws and enforces those laws with guns and nightsticks in the hands of the white racist policemen and black mercenaries. The capitalist system gave birth to these black enclaves and formally articulated the terms of their colonial and dependent status, as was done, for example, by the apartheid government in Zania, South Africa, which the U.S. keeps alive by its support. The struggle for black power in this country is the struggle to free these colonies from external domination. But we do not seek to create communities where, in place of white rulers, black rulers control the lives of black masses and where black money goes into the pockets of a few blacks. We want to see it go into the communal pocket. The society we seek to build among black people is not an oppressive capitalistic society. For capitalism, by its very nature, cannot create structures free from exploitation. We are fighting for the redistribution of wealth and for the end of private property inside the United States. The question that may be asked is, how does the struggle to free these internal colonies relate to your struggle to destroy imperialism? We realistically survey our numbers and know that it is not possible for black people to take over the entire country militarily and hold large areas of land. In a highly industrialized nation, the struggle is different. The heart of production and the heart of commercial trade is in the cities. We are in the cities. With our rebellions, we have become a disruptive force in the flow of services, goods, and capital. Since 1966, the cry of rebellions have been black power. In this cry, there was an ideology implied which the masses understood instinctively. It is because we are powerless that we are oppressed, and it is only with power that we can make the decisions governing our lives and our communities. Those who have power have everything. Those who are without have nothing. Without power, we have to beg for what is rightfully ours. With power, we will take our birthright, because it was with power that our birthright was taken from us. Black power is more than a slogan. It is a way of looking at our problems and the beginning of a solution to them. It attacks racism and exploitation, the horns of the bull that seek to gore us. The United States is a racist country. From its very beginning, it has built itself upon the subjugation of colored people. The Europeans who settled the United States systematically stole the land and destroyed the native population, the natives, forcing them eventually onto reservations where they live today, a mere 0.3% of the total population. At the same time, the United States was waging genocide against the Indians. It was raping the African continent of its natives and bringing them to the Americas to work as slaves. To enslave another human being, one needs a justification, and the United States has always found this justification in proclaiming the superiority of whites and the inferiority of non-whites. We are called the N-word. Spanish speaking people are called other slurs, the Chinese, the Vietnamese. By dehumanizing us and all others of color, it therefore becomes just in the mind of the white man that we should be enslaved, exploited, and oppressed. However, it becomes even easier to keep a man a slave when he himself can be convinced that he is inferior. How much easier is it to keep a man in chains by making him believe his own inferiority? As long as he does, he will keep himself in chains. As long as a slave allows himself to be defined as a slave by the master, he will be a slave, even if the master dies. This technique has been successfully practiced not only against us, but wherever people have been enslaved, oppressed, and exploited. We can see it happening today in the schools of large U.S. cities where Puerto Rican and Mexican children are not allowed to speak Spanish and are taught nothing of their country and their history. It is apparent in many American countries where one is not considered educated unless he has studied in French and speaks French. Black power attacks this brainwashing by saying we will define ourselves. We will no longer accept the white man's definition of ourselves as ugly, ignorant, and uncultured. We will recognize our own beauty and our own culture and will no longer be ashamed of ourselves, for a people ashamed of itself cannot be freed. Because our color has been used as a weapon to oppress us, we must use our color as a weapon of liberation. This is the same as other people using their nationality as a weapon for their liberation. This coming together around our race was an inevitable part of our struggle. We recognize, however, that this is not the totality, only the necessary beginning. Black power recognizes that while we are made to feel inferior, this is only so that we may be more easily exploited. Even if we destroy racism, we will not necessarily destroy exploitation. Thus, we must constantly launch a two-pronged attack. We must constantly keep our eyes on both of the bull's horns. Color and culture were and are a key in our oppression. Therefore, our analysis of history and our economic analysis are rooted in these concepts. Our historical analysis, for example, views the United States as being conceived in racism. Although the first settlers themselves were escaping from oppression, and although their armed uprising against their mother country was around the aggregations of colonialism, taxation without representation, etc., the white European settlers could not extend their lofty theories of democracy to the native, who they systematically exterminated as they expanded into the interior of their country. Indeed, in the same town where the settlers set up their model of government based on the theory of representative democracy, in that same town the first slaves were brought from Africa. In our economic analysis, our interpretation of Marx comes not only from his writings from how we see capitalism's relationship to people of color. The labor movement in the United States, while in the beginning containing some great leaders in the struggle against the absolute control of the economy by the industrial lords, essentially fought only for more money. Those few who had the vision of extending the fight for workers' control of production never succeeded in transmitting their entire vision to the rank of file. This labor found itself asking the industrial lords not to give up their control, but merely to pass out a few more of the fruits of this control. Unlike us, they do not raise questions of redistributing the wealth inside the U.S. Thereby, did the United States anticipate the prophecy of Marx and avoid the inevitable class struggle within the country by expanding into the third world, or the global south, and exploiting the resources and slave labor of people of color. U.S. capitalists never cut down on their domestic products to share with the workers. Instead, they expanded internationally and threw the bones of their profits to the American working class. The American working class enjoys the fruits of the labors of the third world workers. The proletariat has become the third world. The bourgeois is white Western society. The true potential revolutionaries in this country are the black youths of the ghettos, those who have developed insurgents in the cities, or African American and Latin communities, where past rebellions have taught important lessons in dealing with the government's armed reaction to our uprisings. These rebellions should not be taken lightly. In the past 3 years, there have been over 100 uprisings in the eternal colonies of the United States. There are no doubt reported to you as minor disturbances initiated by few malcontents. These are major rebellions with numbers of participants who are developing a consciousness of resistance. It is with increasing concern that we see the United States will, by any means necessary, attempt to prevent the liberation struggles sweeping across the third world. But in particular, we know that the United States fears most the liberation struggles on this continent. In order to secure itself geographically, the United States must have Latin America, both economically, politically, and culturally. It will not do for the English to be isolated on a continent of hostiles. Black power not only addresses itself to exploitation, but to the problems of cultural integrity. Wherever imperialism has gone, she has imposed her culture by force on other people, forcing them to adopt her language and way of life. When African slaves were brought to this country, the Anglo saw that if he took away the language of the African, he broke one of the bonds which kept them united and struggling. Africans were forbidden to speak to each other in their own language. If they were found doing so, they were savagely beaten into silence. Western imperialism has always understood the importance of language to a people's cultural conscience and integrity. When it moved into the third world, it has moved to impose its own language. In Puerto Rico, where Yankee cultural position is at its height, English is taught in all high school for 3 years, while Spanish is taught for 2 years. Anglo society learned other valuable lessons from the enslavement of Africans in this country. When you separate a man's family, as was done to the slaves, you again weaken his resistance. But carry the separation further. Take a few of the weaker slaves and then treat them as house pets. The lighter-skinned slaves, offsprings of the master's rape of African women, was preferred. Give him the crumbs of off the master's table and cast off clothing, and soon he will fear to lose these small comforts. Then use his fears by getting him to report on the activities of the bad slaves, report the impending revolts and uprisings. Distrust and dissent is created among the Africans, and thus they will fight among themselves instead of uniting to fight their oppressors. Today's descendants of African slaves brought to America have been separated from their cultural and natural roots. Black children are not taught of the glory of African civilization and the history of mankind. They are instead taught about Africa, the dark continent inhabited by man-eating savages. They are not taught of the thousands of black martyrs who died resisting the white slave masters. They are not taught of the numerous uprisings and revolts where hundreds of brave Africans refused to submit to slavery. Instead, the history books read of happy slaves slinging in their fields, content with their new lives. The few slaves who did resist are called troublemakers, malcontents, crazy. Black children in North America grow up inspiring only to enter white society, not only because white society eats better, is housed better, and clothes better, and can make a better living, but because they have been bombarded by the white-controlled communications media and educated by black teachers with white minds. Are petty Yankees. Petty Yankee. That white is better, white is beautiful. Anglo features, manner of speech, and aspirations are to be acquired if one is to be successful, even within the community. The white man hardly needs to police his colonies within the country, for he has plundered the cultures and enslaves the mind of people of color until their resistance is paralyzed by self-hate. An important fight in the third world, therefore, is the fight for cultural integrity. Wherever Western society has gone, as Frantz Fanon tells us, she has imposed through force her culture. Through force and bribery, the giving of a few crumbs to a few petty Yankees, the people of a conquered country begin to believe that Western culture is better than their own. The young people begin to put aside the richness of their native culture to take on the tinsel of Western culture. They become ashamed of their roots and inevitably can only be trapped in a life of self-hate and private pursuit for self-gain. Thus does the West entrap whole peoples with little resistance. One of our major battles is to root our corrupt Western values, and our resistance cannot prevail unless our cultural integrity is restored and maintained. It is from our people's history, therefore, that we know our struggles, and your struggles are the same. We have difficulty getting the information we need on what is happening in your countries. In so many ways, we are illiterate of your heroes, your battles, and your victories. We are working now to increase the consciousness of the African American so it will extend internationally. The United States fears this more than anything else, not only because such a consciousness would destroy within black communities the minority complex so carefully cultivated by the Anglos, but because it knows that if the black man realizes that the counterinsurgency efforts of this country are directed against his brother, he will not go, he cannot go. Then it will become crystal clear to the world that the imperialist wars are racist wars. During the past year, instituted a black resistance to the draft movement, not only because we are against black men fighting their brothers in Vietnam, but also because we are certain that the next Vietnam will be on this continent. Perhaps Bolivia, where there are now special force advisors. Perhaps Guatemala, Brazil, Peru, or the Dominican Republic. The African American has tried for the past 400 years to peacefully exist inside the country. It has been to no avail. Our history demonstrates that the reward for trying to peacefully coexist has been physical and psychological murder of our peoples. We have been lynched, our houses have been bombed, and our churches burned. We are now being shot down in the streets like dogs by white racist policemen, and we can no longer accept this oppression without retribution. We must join those who are armed or for armed struggle around the world. We understand that as we expand our resistance and internationalize the consciousness of our people, as our martyred brother Malcolm X taught us, retaliation from the government will come to us as it did to him. As the resistance struggle escalates, we are all well aware of the reality of Che Guevara's words that the struggle will not be a mere street fight, but will be long and harsh. In the end, our common brotherhood sustains us all as we struggle for our liberation by any means necessary. But black power means that we see ourselves as part of the third world, that we see our struggle as closely related to liberation struggles around the world. We must hook up with these struggles. We must, for example, ask ourselves, when black people in Africa begin to storm Johannesburg, when Latin Americans revolt, what will be the role of the United States and that of African Americans? It seems inevitable that this nation will move to protect its financial interests in South Africa and Latin America, which means protecting white rule in these countries. Black people in the United States then have the responsibility to oppose, at least to neutralize that effort by the United States. This is but one example of many such situations which have already risen around the world, with more to come. There is only one place for black Americans in these struggles, and that is on the side of the third world. Frantz Fanon in The Wretched of the Earth puts for clearly the reasons for this in the relationship of the concept of a new force in the world. Let us decide not to imitate Europe. Let us try to create the whole man whom Europe has been incapable of bringing to triumphant birth. 2 centuries ago, a former European colony decided to catch up with Europe. It succeeded so well that the United States of America became a monster in which the taints, the sickness, and the inhumanity of Europe have grown to appalling dimensions. The third world today faces Europe like a colossal mass whose aim should be to try to resolve the problems to which Europe has not been able to find the answers. It is a question of the third world starting a new history of man, a history which will have regard to the sometimes prodigious thesis which Europe has put forward, but which will also not forget Europe's crimes, of which the most horrible was committed in the heart of man, and consisted of the pathological tearing apart of his functions and the crumbling away of his unity. No, there is no question of a return to nature. It is simply a very concrete question of not dragging men towards mutilation, of not imposing upon the brain rhythms which very quickly obliterate it and wreck it. The pretext of catching up must not be used to push man around, to tear him away from himself or from his privacy, to break and kill him. No, we do not want to catch up with anyone. What we want to do is go forward all the time, night by day, in the company of man, in the company of all men. Thanks be to Kwame Ture. Okay, so I finished reading that. I am happy. I am very happy. I said that I wanted to read Frantz Fanon. Do I have time to read Frantz Fanon? I hope so. Let's see if we can read Frantz Fanon. Okay, baby. I'm being silly. Let me see if I can go to the table of contents. Okay, so I'm gonna read a little bit from Frantz Fanon's on national culture, and hopefully you guys will be able to pull something from this. And I read this book in high school. It took me 2 years to read it because I had ADHD, and I was in pre-IB, and then I went to international baccalaureate, and then I dropped out of international baccalaureate due to depression and stuff. So I had a lot going on, but this book helped ground me in ways that I appreciate to this day. And I have been rereading it sporadically, but I really should sit down and give it a good once over read because it's amazing. And once again, it's called Frantz Fanon's The Wretched of the Earth. You should have heard about it at least once. It's okay if you haven't, though. Okay. Okay. It is not enough to write a revolutionary hymn to be a part of the African Revolution. One has to join with the people to make this revolution. Make it with the people and the hymns will automatically follow. For an act to be authentic, one has to be a vital part of Africa in its thinking, part of all that popular energy mobilized for the liberation, progress, and happiness of Africa. Outside this single struggle, there is no place for either the artist or the intellectual who is not committed and totally mobilized with the people in the great fight waged by Africa and suffering humanity. Each generation must discover its mission, fulfill it, or betray it in a relative opacity. In the underdeveloped countries, preceding generations have simultaneously resisted the insidious agenda of colonialism and paved the way for the emergence of the current struggles. Now that we are in the heat of combat, we must shed the habit of decrying the efforts of our forefathers or feigning incomprehension at their silence or passiveness. They fought as best as they could with the weapons they possessed at the time, and if their struggle did not reverberate throughout the international arena, the reason should be attributed not so much to a lack of heroism, but to a fundamentally different international situation. More than one colonized subject had to say, "We've had enough." More than one tribe had to rebel. More than one peasant revolt had to be quelled. More than one demonstration to be repressed for us today to stand firm, certain of our victory. For those of us who are determined to break the back of colonialism, our historic mission is to authorize every revolt, every desperate act, and every attack aborted or drowned in blood. In this chapter, we shall analyze the fundamental issue of the legitimate claim to a nation. The political party that mobilizes the people, however, is little concerned with this issue of legitimacy. Political parties are concerned solely with daily reality, and it is in the name of this reality, in the name of this immediacy, which influences the present and future of men and women, that they make their call to action. The political party may very well speak on the nation in emotional terms, but it is primarily interested in getting the people who are listening to understand that they must join the struggle if they want quite simply to exist. We now know in the first phase of the national struggle, colonialism attempts to effuse nationalist demands by manipulating economic doctrine. At the first signs of a dispute, colonialism feigns comprehension by acknowledging with obstinate humility that the territory is suffering from serious underdevelopment. that requires major social and economic reforms. And it is true that certain spectacular measures, such as the opening of work sites for the unemployed here and there, delay the formation of a national consciousness by a few years. But sooner or later, colonialism realizes it is incapable of achieving a program of socio-economic reforms that would satisfy the aspirations of the colonized masses. Even when it comes to filling their bellies, colonialism proves to be inherently powerless. The colonist state very quickly discovers that any attempt to disarm the national parties at a purely economic level will be tantamount to practicing in the colonies what it did not want to do on its own territory. And it is no coincidence that today the doctrine of Cartierism is on the rise just about everywhere. Cartier's bitter disillusionment with France's stubborn determination to retain ties with people it will have to feed, whereas so many French citizens are in dire straits, reflects colonialism's inability to transform itself into a nonpartisan aid program. Here, once again, no need to waste time repeating, better to go hungry with dignity than to eat one's fill in slavery. On the contrary, we must persuade ourselves that colonialism is incapable of procuring for colonized peoples the material conditions likely to make them forget their quest for dignity. Once colonialism has understood where its social reform tactics would lead, back come the older reflexes of adding police reinforcements, dispatching troops, and establishing a regime of terror better suited to its interests and its psychology. Within the political parties, or rather parallel to them, we find a cultured class of colonized intellectuals. The recognition of a national culture and its right to exist represent their favorite stamping ground. Whereas the politicians integrate their actions in the present, the intellectuals place themselves in the context of history. Faced with the colonized intellectuals' debunking of the colonial history of a pre-colonial barbarism, the colonialism's response is mute. It is especially mute since the ideas put forward by the young colonized intelligentsia are widely accepted by metropolitan specialists. It is in fact now commonly recognized that for several decades, numerous European researchers have widely rehabilitated African, Mexican, and Peruvian civilizations. Some have been surprised by the passion invested by these colonized intellectuals in their defense of a national culture. But those who consider this passion exaggerated are strangely apt to forget that their psyche and their ego are conveniently safeguarded by a French or German culture whose worth have been proven and which has gone unchallenged. I concede the fact that the actual existence of Aztec civilization has done little to change the diet of today's Mexican peasant. I concede that whatever proof there is of a once mighty Songhai civilization does not change the fact that the Songhais today are undernourished, illiterate, abandoned to the skies and waters with a blank mind and glazed eyes. But as we have said on several occasions, this passionate quest for a national culture prior to the colonial era can be justified by the colonized intellectuals' shared interests, and stepping back and taking a hard look at the Western culture in which they risk becoming ensnared. Oh, that's a banger. Fully aware that they are in the process of losing themselves and consequently of being lost to their people, these men work away with raging heart and furious mind to renew contact with their people's oldest inner essence, the farthest removed from colonial times. Let us delve deeper, perhaps. This passion and this rage are nurtured or at least guided by the secret hope of discovering beyond the present wretchedness, beyond this self-hatred, this abdication and denial, some magnificent and shining era that redeems us in our own eyes and those of others. I say that I have decided to delve deeper, since perhaps in their unconscious the colonized intellectuals have been unable to come to loving terms with the present history of their oppressed people. Since there is little to marvel at in its current state of barbarity, they have decided to go further, to delve deeper, and they must have been overjoyed to discover that the past was not branded with shame, but dignity, glory, and sobriety. Reclaiming the past does not only rehabilitate or justify the promise of a national culture, it triggers a change of fundamental importance in the colonizers' psycho-affective equilibrium. Perhaps it has not been sufficiently demonstrated that colonialism is not content merely to impose its law on the colonized country, present and future. Colonialism is not satisfied with snaring the people in its net or of draining the colonized brain of any form or substance. With a kind of perverted logic, it turns its attention to the past of the colonized people and distorts it, disfigures it, and destroys it. This effort to demean history prior to colonization today takes on a dialectical significance. Another good highlight. Wow. When we consider the resources deployed to achieve the cultural alienation so typical of the colonial period, we realize that nothing was left to chance and that the final aim of colonization was to convince the indigenous population it would save them from darkness. The result was to hammer into the heads of the indigenous population that if the colonized were to leave, they would regress into barbarism, degradation, and bestiality. At the level of the unconscious, therefore, colonialism was not seeking to be perceived by the indigenous population as a sweet, kind-hearted mother who protects her child from a hostile environment, but rather a mother who constantly prevents her basically perverse child from committing suicide or giving free rein to its malevolent instincts. The colonial mother is protecting the child from itself, from its ego, its psychology, its biology, and its ontological misfortune. Interesting. In the context, there is nothing extravagant about the demands of the colonized intellectual, simply a demand for a coherent program. The colonized intellectual who wants to put his struggle on a legitimate footing, who is intent on providing proof and accepts to bear himself in order to better display the history of his body, is fated to journey deep into the very bowels of his people. This journey into the depths is not specifically national. The colonized intellectual who decides to combat these colonialist lies does so on a continental scale. Wow. The past is revered. The culture which has been retrieved from the past to be displayed in all its splendor is not his national culture. Colonialism, little troubled by nuances, has always claimed that the N-word was a savage, not an Angolan or a Nigerian, but an N-word. For colonialism, this vast continent was a den of savages infested with superstitions and fanaticism, destined to be despised, cured by God, a land of cannibals, a land of N-words. Colonialism's condemnation is continental in scale. Colonialism claimed that the pre-colonial period was akin to a darkness of the human soul. Refers to the entire continent of Africa. The colonized endeavors to rehabilitate himself and escape the sting of colonialism obey the same rules of logic. The colonized intellectual, steeped in Western culture and set on proving the existence of his own culture, never does so in the name of Angola or Dahomey. The culture proclaimed is African culture. When the black man, who has never felt as much as a Negro as he has under white domination, decides to prove his culture and act as a cultivated person, he realizes that history imposes on him a terrain already mapped out, that history sets him along a very precise path, and that he is expected to demonstrate the existence of a Negro culture. And it is also too true that the major responsibility for this racialization of thought, or at least the way it is applied, lies with the Europeans who have never stopped placing white culture in opposition to the other monocultures. Colonialism did not think it's while denying one national culture after the other. Consequently, the colonized response was immediately continental in scope. In Africa, colonized literature over the last 20 years has not been a national literature, but a Negro literature. The concept of negritude, for example, was the effective, if not logical, antithesis of that insult with which the white man has leveled at the rest of humanity. This negritude, hurled against the contempt of the white man, has alone proved capable in some sectors of lifting taboos and maledictions. Because the Guinean intellectuals were above all confronted with a generalized ostracism and the syncretic contempt of the colonizer, their reaction was one of self-regard and celebration. Following the unconditional affirmation of European culture came the unconditional affirmation of African culture. Hmm. Generally speaking, the bards of negritude would contrast old Europe versus young Africa, dull reasons versus poetry, and stifling logic versus exuberant nature. On the one side, there stood rigidity, ceremony, protocol, and skepticism. On the other, naivete, petulance, freedom, and indeed luxuriance, but also irresponsibility. The bards of negritude did not hesitate to reach beyond the borders of the continent. Black voices from America took up the refrain on a larger scale. The black world came into being in Busia from Ghana, Birago Diop from Senegal, Hampate Ba from Mali, and St. Clair Drake from Chicago were quick to claim common ties and identical lines of thought. This might be an appropriate time to look at the example of the Arab world. We know that most of the Arab territories came under colonial domination. Colonialism used the same tactics in these regions to inculcate the notion that the pre-colonial history of the indigenous population had been steeped in barbarity. The struggle for national liberation was linked to a cultural phenomenon commonly known as the awakening of Islam. Interesting. The passion displayed by contemporary Arab authors in reminding their people of the great chapters of Arab history is in response to the lies of the occupier. The great names of Arabic literature have been recorded in the past of the Arab civilization has been branded with the same zeal and ardor of that of the African civilizations. The Arab leaders have tried to revive that famous Dar es Islam, which exerted such a shining influence in 12th, 13th, and 14th centuries. Today, at a political level, the Arab League is a concrete example of this determination to revive the legacy of the past and carry it to a conclusion. Today, Arab physicians and poets hail each other across borders in their endeavor to launch a new Arab culture, a new Arab civilization. They join forces in the name of Arabism, which is the guiding light for their thoughts. In the Arab world, however, even under colonial domination, nationalist feeling has been kept alive at an intensity unknown in Africa. As a result, the Arab League shows no sign of that spontaneous solidarity between members of the group. On the contrary, paradoxically, each member endeavors to praise the achievements of his nation. Although the cultural element has been free from that lack of differentiation that is characteristic of the African world, the Arabs do not always manage to forget their common identity when faced with an objective. Their actual cultural experience is not national but Arab. The issue at stake is not yet to secure a national culture, not yet to plunge into the groundswell of nations, but rather to pit an Arab or African culture against the universal condemnation of the colonizer. Okay. From both the Arab and African perspectives, the claims of the colonized intellectual are syncretic, continental in scope, and in the case of the Arabs, global. Syncretic, what does that mean? Oh, okay. This historical obligation to racialize their claims to emphasize an African culture rather than a national culture leads the African intellectuals into a dead end. Let us take an example of the African Society for Culture. This society was created by African intellectuals for a mutual exchange of ideas, experiences, and research. The aim of the society was therefore to establish the existence of an African culture, to detail it nation by nation, and review the inner dynamism of each of the national cultures. But at the same time, this society was responding to another demand, the need to take its place within the ranks of the European Society for Culture that threatened to turn into the Universal Society for Culture. At the root of this decision, there was therefore the preoccupation which taking its place on an equal footing in the universal arena, armed with a culture sprung from the very bowels of the African continent. Very quickly, however, this society proved incapable of handling these assignments, and members' behavior was reduced to window dressing operations, such as proving to the Europeans that an African culture didn't exist, and in pitting themselves against the narcissism and ostentation of the Europeans. We have demonstrated that such an attitude was normal and drew its legitimacy from the lie propagated by European intellectual. But the aims of this society were to deteriorate seriously once the concept of negritude had been elaborated. Interesting. The African Society for Culture was to become the Cultural Society for the Black World and was forced to include the black diaspora, i.e., the dozens of millions of blacks throughout the Americas. The blacks who lived in the United States, Central, and Latin America, in fact, needed a cultural matrix to cling to. The problem they were faced with was not basically any different from that of the Africans, interestingly enough. The whites in America had not behaved any different to them than the white colonizers had to the Africans. We have seen how the whites were used to putting all Negroes in the same basket. So, during the first Congress of the African Society for Culture in Paris in 1956, the black Americans spontaneously considered their problems from the same standpoint as their fellow Africans. By integrating the former slaves into African civilization, the African intellectuals accorded them an acceptable civil status. But gradually, the black Americans realized that their existential problems differed from those faced by the Africans. The only common denominator between the blacks from Chicago's and the Nigerians or the Tanganyikans was that they all defined themselves in relation to the whites. But once the initial comparisons had been made and subjective feelings had settled down, the black Americans realized that objective problems were fundamentally different. The principle and purpose of the Freedom Rides, whereby black and white Americans endeavor to combat racial discrimination, have little in common with the heroic struggle of the Angolan people against the antiquity of the Portuguese colonialism. Consequently, during the Second Congress of the African Society for the Culture of Black Americans decided to create the American Society for African Culture. Negritude thus came up against its first limitation, namely those phenomena that take into account the historicizing of men. Negro or Negro African culture broke up because the men who set out to embody it realized that every culture is first and foremost national, and that the problems for which Richard Wright or Langston Hughes had to be on the alert were fundamentally different from those faced by Leopold Senghor or Jomo Kenyatta. Likewise, certain Arab states who had struck up the glorious hymn to an Arab Renaissance were forced to realize that their geographical position and their region's economic interdependence were more important than the revival of their past. Consequently, the Arab states today are organically linked to Mediterranean societies and cultures. The reason being that these states are subject to modern pressures and new commercial channels, whereas the great trade routes of the days of Arab expansion have now disappeared. But above all, there is the fact that the political regimes of certain Arab states are so heterogeneous and alien to each other that any encounter, even culture between these states, proves meaningless. It is clear, therefore, that the way the cultural problem is posed in certain colonized countries can lead to serious ambiguities. Colonialism's insistence that the N-words have no culture and Arabs are by nature barbaric and veritably leads to a glorification of cultural phenomena that become continental as international and singularly racialized. In Africa, there is a reasoning of the intellectual is black African or Arab Islamic. It is not specifically national. Culture is increasingly cut off from reality. It finds safe havens in the refuge of smoldering of emotions and has difficulties cutting a straightforward path that would nevertheless be the only one likely to endow it with productiveness, homogeneity, and substance. Through historically limited, the fact remains that the actions of the colonized intellectual do much to support and justify the actions of the politicians. And it is true that the attitude of the colonized intellectuals sometimes take on the aspect of a cult or religion, but under closer analysis, it is clearly reflects he is only too aware that he is running the risk of severing the last remaining ties with his people. This stated belief in the existence of a national culture is in fact a burning, desperate return to anything. In order to secure his salvation, in order to escape the supremacy of white culture, the colonized intellectual feels the need to return to his unknown roots and lose himself, come what may, among his barbaric people, because he feels he is becoming alienated. In other words, the living focus of contradiction which risk becoming insurmountable. The colonized intellectual wrenches himself from the quagmire. or threatens to suck him down, and determined to believe what he finds, he accepts and ratifies it with heart and soul. He finds himself bound to answer for everything and everyone. He not only becomes an advocate, he accepts being included with the others, and henceforth he can afford to laugh at his past cowardice. This painful and harrowing wrench is, however, a necessity. Otherwise, we'll be faced with extremely serious psychoaffective mutilations. Individuals without an anchorage, without borders, colorless, stateless, rootless, a body of angels. And it will come as no surprise to hear some colonizers say, speaking as a Senegalese in a French land, speaking as an Algerian and a Frenchman, stumbling over the need to assume two nationalities, two determinations, the intellectual who is Arab and French, or Nigerian and English if he wants to be sincere with himself, chooses the negation of one of these two determinations. Unusually unwilling or unable to choose, the intellectuals collect all the historical determinations which have conditioned them and place themselves in a thoroughly universal perspective. The reason being that the colonized intellectual has thrown himself headlong into Western culture, like adopted children who only stop investigating their new family environment once their psyche has formed a minimum core of reassurance. The colonized intellectual will endeavor to make the European culture his own, not content with knowing Rabelais or Diderot, Shakespeare, or Edgar Allan Poe. He will stretch his mind until he identifies with them completely. La dame n'était pas seule. Elle avait un mari très comme il faut, qui citait Racine et Corneille, elle Voltaire et Rousseau, et les Pierre Hugo et les Juan Musset, et Guy et Valéry, et tant d'autres encore. In some cases, however, at the very moment when the nationalist parties mobilize the people in the name of national independence, the colonized intellectual rejects his accomplishment and suddenly feeling them to be alienating. But this is easier said than done. The intellectual who has slipped into Western civilization through a culture backdoor, who has managed to embody or rather change bodies with European civilization, will realize that the cultural model he would like to integrate for authenticity's sake offers little in the way of figureheads capable of standing up to comparison with the many illustrious names in the civilizations of the occupier. History, of course, written by and for Westerners, may periodically enhance the image of certain episodes of the African past, but faced with his country's present-day status, lucidity, and objectively observing the reality of the continent he would like to claim as his own, the intellectual is terrified by the void, the mindlessness, and the savagery. Yet he feels he must escape this white culture. He must look elsewhere, anywhere, for a lack of cultural stimulus comparable to the glorious panorama flaunted by the colonizer. The colonized intellectual frequently lapses into heated arguments and develops a psychology dominated by an exaggerated sensitivity, and suspectability. This movement of withdrawal, which first of all comes from a petito principi in its psychological mechanism and physiology, above all calls to mind a muscular reflex, a muscular contraction. The foregoing is sufficient to explain the style of the colonized intellectuals who make up their mind to assert this phase of liberating consciousness. A jagged style full of imagery, for the image is the drawbridge that lets out the unconscious forces into the surrounding metals. An energetic style, alive with rhythms, bursting with life. A colorful style, too, bronze, bathed in sunlight and harsh. This style, which Westerners once found just jarring, is not, as some would have it, a racial feature, but above all reflects a single-handed combat, and reveals how necessary it is for the intellectual to inflict injury on himself, to actually bleed red blood and free himself from that part of his being already contaminated by the germs of decay. A swift, painful combat where inevitably the muscle has to replace the concept. Alright, I'm going to go ahead and bookmark here. I've read quite a bit. Let me see if I can read a note. Okay. Hi, I'm back. Thank you so much for joining me to read today. I had fun. And I kind of hope you had a good time too. It's always good to read Frantz Fanon and to get yourself into check. So I'm gonna see if I can finish reading that cultural chapter tomorrow, and if not, then I'll see if I can finish reading it the next time I stream. But thank you for joining me. I hope you had a good time, and I hope you learned something today. Thank you, and have a good evening.